Hello, and welcome to our live stream. I'm Steve Robbins, and with me here today is Chris Ye, who is serial entrepreneur, author, speaker, coach, venture capitalist, all kinds of things. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Stever. And I think it's important to note for the audience that you and I have known each other since 1998. Despite the fact that we both look so youthful, it can't possibly be that we've been around that long. We
Oh my
met
God! You
we
know
met
what?
on the first day of kindergarten, I'm sure.
Exactly. I love to rewrite history, and there comes an age where your mental stability depends on the ability to consistently rewrite history. Um, Yeah, I mean, when we met, we were both relatively green behind the ears and young, sprightly beginners. And now, of course, we're both old and wizened and have great knowledge to impart unto the masses. Um, one of the things that impressed me, I think, shortly after we met, I don't know if you were a founder of PB Works, but
Yes, so I was not a founder of PB Works, but I was one of the first investors in the company and then
okay,
joined the company and helped run it.
got it. So, what was that, and what conceptual groundwork did you thus lay at PB Works that persists to this day and in fact pervades significant portions of the world?
Well, so this is an interesting one. With PB Works, the origin of PB Works stems from a guy named David Weekley, an entrepreneur whom I had actually met at a friend's birthday party. And David had created a series of hackathons called Super Happy Dev House here in the Bay Area. It actually became very famous. It spun off into something called the Hacker Dojo. And David is just a person who is a community builder in the field of technology here in the Bay Area. And at the very first Super Happy Dev House hackathon, he hacked together what was then known as PB Wiki, because he's like, he had all these friends who had been asking him to set up wikis for their companies. And they used the Media Wiki software, which is what powered Wikipedia back then, may still do so today. And he said, this is such a pain to run. I have to set up a server and do all that. Why can't I just make a service where it's really easy? You can set up a wiki in 60 seconds. And he created PB Wiki and released it into the world. And it began getting a lot of traction. A lot of folks were joining in and taking part and signing up. And he's like, oh, wow, maybe there's a business here. And so that's how I got involved. I was a big fan of the product and what they were doing. And he had also partnered with another friend of mine, Ramit Sethi, who is a pretty well-known personal finance guru these days. And I said, hey, guys, I love you guys. I want to help. I want to invest whenever you actually raise money. And so I was able to be one of the first investors in the company. And then later on, they asked me if I would help them as a consultant and advisor, which I did for a couple of days before they then said, well, we really need you to work full time. And so I ended up doing that. But it was a great experience. The reason I said yes is because I had had a pretty good career up to that point. But most of my connections in Silicon Valley were in the investor world with venture capitalists and angel investors and folks like that. I didn't have a lot of connections with great technologists. And at the heart of Silicon Valley, while business really matters, is technology, incredible technologies, advances, things like that. And it's really more effective if you know some of the technologists yourself. And so I agreed to join the company under the condition that David would introduce me to all of these great technologists and help integrate me into that part of Silicon Valley, which he did. He was good to his word. And that then helped with all the things I did later on in terms of being able to connect to folks, in terms of having gotten this direct experience in community building and whatnot.
Interesting. So, what happened to PB Works? Because obviously you're not there anymore.
So PB Works still exists, and I'm still an advisor to the company. If you go to pbworks.com, you can still sign up and use it, and there's still millions of people who use it. But as it turns out, the pure wiki technology is a little bit of a dead end. I call it the original sin. Like when I invested in the company, my hypothesis was that wikis would eventually become dominant, and it would be one of the things that people used everywhere. And it turns out that, people are not quite as comfortable with it. Now, there's a lot of wiki-like things that are doing very well. For example, if you look at something like Notion, Notion is very wiki-like.
As soon as you said wiki-like things, my first thought was, oh, I never thought of it, but Notion is pretty wiki-like. Yep.
Exactly. So it turns out that the pure wiki was not the way to go, right? You needed to have one of these hybrid things. And so even though PBWiki was able to find millions of users, it wasn't able to find tens or hundreds of millions of users. So as a result, the company still exists. It actually has a new product called Dockio, which I think I encourage you to try out. Pretty cool product that connects you to all your cloud content. So your different files in Box and Dropbox and Google Drive, your email attachments in Gmail, your file attachments in Slack, even things like Notion. Because guess what? We now have all these systems where stuff lives, and we end up doing most of the integration ourselves as the human integration layer. So Dockio is working on that problem, but the company still operates the PBWorks service even today.
I had no idea. Yes, I remember you introduced me to Dockio, and I've played with it, and I think it's a cool product. I don't actually have my stuff spread across too many clouds. I figured out early on that it was just not that I was going to go crazy before Dockio existed. So I kind of concentrated everything on just one or two places. But Dockio is a pretty incredible thing, and I had no idea that was related to the original PBWorks.
Yeah, pretty astonishing. The two are sort of different, and the Dockio came about as a reaction to the lesson of PBWorks, which is, well, if you're going to store content, you have to be the primary repository. You have to win over the Stevers of the world and get them to make you their primary repository. And we realized we'd gotten to a point where it was difficult to win that battle. Folks had already won that war, whether it was Google Drive or Dropbox or what have you. And so we said, well, let's switch around. Let's now tackle the issue that people have, which is because they often work across different companies and different organizations, they often use different platforms, because even when an organization standardizes on a platform, cross-organization collaboration relies on different platforms. And so that's where the Dockio idea came from.
Got it. Well, it does a good job at what it does. And I'm totally with you in terms of the cross company collaboration. I have not spent much of my career in large companies. I've largely been a consultant, or I've been an executive coach, or I have been involved in different kind of integrative activities. And it has always blown me away that you can have a company that is so unbelievably insularly devoted to tool X, whatever X is. Maybe it's the Microsoft Office suite or whatever, and yet they use all of these people who aren't inside their walls. They have consultants, they have vendors, they have suppliers, all of whom use different systems. And to a large degree, the way that they attempt to solve the integration problem is whoever has the most power in any given work group simply dictates, well, really sorry that you don't use XYZ platform, but now you're going to, because that's what we're going to use to get our work done. And
and if you don't use it, you don't get paid.
Right, exactly. And at the end of the day, I'm at work to get paid. So speaking of getting paid, I actually did not know that your primary background or your primary connections were in finance. I've always thought of you as an operator.
So that's the interesting thing. And I would say that, for most of my career, I was an operator, and I've made this transition to finance. But it's interesting that I actually began, you could argue, in the financial world. So when I graduated from Stanford, the first company I worked for is D.E. Shaw and Company. And D.E. Shaw is pretty famous as one of the world's most successful quantitative hedge funds. And so I ended up working for a Wall Street firm, if you will. And actually, technically, their offices were in Midtown, but it's high finance. And David Shaw was at computer science at Columbia, but he also worked for a number of very famous financiers. And the company was enormously successful. And I joined them to work on their internet projects. So I was really always more on the internet side, but I got to pick up a lot on the finance side just by osmosis, and just because I was curious about what the company was doing. And since then, obviously I've been an operator, a founder, an executive at various technology companies here in Silicon Valley, and then finally circled back around because, when you get to the age of your late 30s, like you and I, Stever, maybe you start to think, hey.
Well, late 30s, mid 30s.
Mid 30s, there we go. You start to think, it's probably time to change what I'm doing, and instead of being the operator who is staying up until midnight every night, be the wise counselor, advisor, and investor who helps the companies, but is no longer the person who's actually doing the stuff himself.
Sure. So, I mean, the thing that we reconnected over a couple of years ago was, in fact, blitzscaling. Can you tell us what is blitzscaling? What's the book? What is the concept? What's the book? how did you get into this, and what are you doing now? Because it's taken you someplace really interesting that I know if I had a bunch of disposable money, I would toss it in your direction.
Absolutely. So blitzscaling is a concept that I came up with along with my friend Reid Hoffman, who many people know, very famous guy, founding board member at PayPal, first investor in Facebook, co-founder of LinkedIn, Series A investor in Airbnb, and many, many other amazing things. And we wrote the book because we were trying to explain what is the secret behind the startup world. We exist in a period of time over the past 30 years or so where just the incredible growth of the startup world has been astonishing, right? If we go back in time 30 years, the kinds of companies that were, the most valuable companies in the world, it's Johnson and Johnson and General Electric and Exxon Mobil and companies like that. And today it's all technology companies, and technology companies have really taken over. Mark Andreessen famously said, software is eating the world, and it really has happened. It's more like software has eaten the world. And what we did with Blitzscaling is say, okay, well, why is this? And what we concluded is that because of the internet, because of the global connectivity, there were more and more winner-take-most markets. And in a winner-take-most market, the objective should be win the market. Get to scale first, get the effects to kick in, whether it's network effects or scale effects, and become the dominant player, the enduring market leader, where you can print money for decades. And that's the story that we've seen play out, whether it is with Apple, Amazon, Google, what have you. And so we wrote the book Blitzscaling to chronicle that, because we felt like people didn't really understand the dynamic. And the book came out, and we taught a class at Stanford in 2015. The book finally came out in 2018. And if anything, the world has just gone more blitzscaling crazy since then, right? If you sort of think about the past 4 years, there have been so many examples of first blitzscaling in the company world. We've seen the rise, the incredible growth of things like cryptocurrency and Web3 at just insane pace. We've seen blitzscaling play out in terms of how we attacked the COVID-19 pandemic, right? People thought, no vaccine has ever gotten out to the market in less than 4 years. And all of a sudden, a significant chunk of the world is vaccinated starting less than 2 years after the beginning of the pandemic. It was a quite astonishing thing. And so the need for speed has never been greater. And we've been very excited about how the ideas of blitzscaling are out there. And of course, like an author, you normally, as you're an author, Steve, normally the way you make money is through speaking and consulting and media work and things like that. But in the case of blitzscaling, because it's specifically focused on the fastest growing companies in the world and how are you going to make a $100 billion company, there's another way to monetize, which is to create Blitzscaling Ventures, a venture firm that invests in blitzscaling companies that are going to be enduring market leaders. And that's something I've been working on during the pandemic. And we've raised a considerable sum of money to invest in these companies. We've already made 5 or 6 investments in these various companies. I'm getting to work with some of the great entrepreneurs in the world. So it's been fantastic.
So tell me something. Presumably not every company can do a blitz scaling, I don't know what you call it, a initiative or isn't structurally the right kind of business, right? For example, I am reasonably certain that my corner convenience store could not be considered for blitzscaling. How do we know that the opportunity we found or the idea that we have is something that can really go big like that and take over a market?
Absolutely. So we lay all this out in the book, and we talk about what we call the growth factors and limiters of scaling. And it really boils down to a couple of key factors that need to be in place. Now, there's a first set of factors that are what I call necessary but insufficient. And these are things that need to be in place, but their presence does not mean it's necessarily a blitzscaling opportunity. It just means that blitzscaling will make sense. So these include things like having a large global market. That's the issue with your corner convenience store. If you're going to focus on speed ahead of efficiency, if you're going to invest in growth, you need a lot of headroom. And your local convenience store, your local dry cleaner doesn't have that headroom. Now, could you create an entire chain of convenience stores or an entire chain of local dry cleaners? Perhaps, right? But that's a different story for another time. Then you also have, do you have high gross margins? Do you have the ability to actually make money? Because we're really looking for companies that can print money. And that is a big part of it. If you have a company that can grow rapidly, but it doesn't make any money, it's really hard to make it work. And then, of course, you need product market fit.
With enough venture capital, however, you can have it hang on for a very long time.
Oh, absolutely. And you can harvest a lot of that value. As anybody who watches the television show We Crashed or followed the WeWork story can tell you. I mean, Adam Norman managed to walk away from the disaster he created with well over $1 billion in his pocket.
I'm not so sure, though, that's a lesson that I want my teenage nephew to to walk away with about how to succeed in the world. But,
No, definitely not. The unfortunate thing is, and this is a brief sidebar, once when I was undergraduate, I had a chance to meet the great author Ken Keyes, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he was a very famous figure, the Merry Pranksters, big fan of LSD and psychedelics and other things like that. He's one of the main characters in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Chest. Anyways, I had a chance when I was an undergrad to hear Ken speak and then to go to dinner with him. And Ken spoke, and then at dinner he was he was not particularly guarded to begin with, but then at dinner he was really cutting loose. And he said something which I've always remembered, which he said, "Shit floats and cream rises." And what that means is that we just cannot. I
think we'll need an explanation of that.
The meaning is sometimes people rise to the top because they're cream, because they're incredibly capable, because they do wonderful things. And sometimes shit floats because
Let's see if I can.
Stever, are you there? Stever hopped off. Oh, but maybe he's coming back. So Stever hopped off, but don't worry, I'll keep telling the story. Sometimes people rise to the top because they're cream. Other times people rise to the top because they're shit, because they are takers in the Adam Grant parlance. They are schemers. They are bad people. And the point is, there are different ways to achieve financial success in this world. I happen to think that it's much better achieving financial success by being the cream rising to the top, but there are people who float to the top and are not punished for their sins. The guilty are not necessarily punished. The world is not necessarily fair, and bad things happen.
Wow. All right. Well, let's go back to the story of being the cream.
Yes.
Where you have where scale is possible and will convey an advantage. Where you have genuine margins. What else?
So in addition to that, you need the ability to scale your operations and your personnel, your organization. Because at the end of the day, it's very rare that a company can, generate billions of dollars of profits with one or two people. Not theoretically impossible. You could probably run a pretty good trading desk with a relatively small number of people. I always joked when I was at D.E. Shaw that just like Google, you could probably run the company with 1% of the personnel and not even impact the revenue or profitability. In fact, dramatically increase the profitability. It's just the companies were so profitable, they could afford to have the other 99% of employees as a luxury to pursue other things. But in most cases, you need personnel, you need salespeople, you need customer service people, you need accountants, you need engineers, you need all of these things. And so your organization is going to grow. And if you're not able to grow it effectively, then your growth is going to be constrained. Or the infrastructure, right? You and I both remember the very first mainstream social network, Friendster, which grew very rapidly, but ran into severe infrastructure problems. Their infrastructure couldn't handle it. Their web pages were taking multiple minutes to load, and it ultimately killed their ability to grow. So you have to be able to grow your organization and your operations as well. So those are all things that are necessary but not sufficient. They're necessary because they are a part of being a great business. They can be worth a lot of money, but they're not sufficient because there's nothing about them that says you have to go really, really fast in order to succeed. That's where the other two final primary factors come in. One is the winner-take-most market, which I refer to, depending on the generation, and I think, Steve, you're my generation, so I can refer to it as a Glenn Ross market, and you'll know what I mean.
Oh, I have no idea what that means.
So Glenn Ross is the classic first David Mamet play, then made into a movie, starring Jack Lemmon, Ed Harris, and with a very notable Al Pacino, but with a very notable cameo from Alec Baldwin, who gives his famous speech, "Always Be Closing," may remember that. You've probably seen it at various points in time. And in it, he tells the salespeople, you're fired. But the good news is, you have a chance to win your job back. And it's all a contest. And first prize is a Cadillac Eldorado. Second prize is a set of steak knives. And third prize is you're fired. And that's how we describe these markets, right? You have to have these dynamics that make it a Glengarry, Glen Ross market. The alternative for a younger generation is that they are a Ricky Bobby market, because Ricky Bobby from the Will Ferrell movie Talladega Nights says, if you ain't first, you're last, which is a slightly more succinct way of putting it. So the whole point is, do you have a winner take most market dynamic? And usually it's because of network effects, because network effects means that as the number of users grows, the value per user also grows. And if you multiply a rapidly increasing number of users by an increasing value per user, you get exponential value growth. I mean, it's huge.
Yeah.
And that's why these companies are worth so much. But the other thing that happens is as the network value increases, then it becomes impossible for a competitor to catch up, because they can clone your product exactly down to the pixel, offer it to the public for free, and the product value is dwarfed by the network value. So they can never really make an argument for why to use you. This is why, when people, if somebody says, oh, I've made Facebook, but it has all the same features, but it doesn't have any of the users, nobody would bother to sign up for it. That's why the logic that people had of, oh, I'm going to invest in Bebo or High Five because it's 1/5 the size of Facebook, but it's 1/10 the cost. I'm like, there's no mean reversion. It's not a stable point. These things are not going to survive because they cannot catch up. They cannot achieve that market dominant position.
Right. And that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand. Is that, we're certainly raised to believe, or at least I was in my MBA program at that other school that isn't Stanford. I was raised to believe that if you have a good product and at a decent cost, you could win in the market. And in fact, that's super not the case. In fact, I mean, as you're mentioning, network effects where users give you lock-in because everyone wants to be where everyone else is. And so once there's a dominant platform, everyone goes there. But we also have that same thing around technology. I find it kind of funny that no one questions the idea that Microsoft and Apple are the two dominant software or two dominant computer companies. And I'm like, look, what do you think the odds are that the first two commercial companies to exist ever in the computer industry just happened to be the best products? Like, of course not. However, once you have people writing software for a particular platform and people using that software, now switching away from that software also means leaving the platform, and you just get this mutually reinforcing effect. And I think Bill Gates actually, I think he figured that out pretty early on.
Oh, yes.
And a lot of the 90s was really Bill attempting to use his operating system position to force people to buy his Office suite, and then using his Office suite to force people to stay on his operating system. And in fact, he was found guilty of antitrust for a number of these kinds of maneuvers. But it worked.
Yeah.
And
the funny thing is, by the way, this is just the pathologically competitive side. The natural forces would allow Microsoft to do that. They didn't have to undertake the anti-competitive steps they took. They just did that because Bill really wanted to win and was a relentless competitor. But it probably was to his detriment, because the natural forces would have led to the same outcome without the DOJ getting involved.
Yeah. Well, and I even wonder, I mean, I remember that trial because I was both a Microsoft and an Apple user at that point. And I still remember one of the big defenses that Microsoft used was the specific thing that triggered a lot of the stuff was when Microsoft shipped with the Internet Explorer icon basically permanently attached to the desktop. And Microsoft's explanation, which was actually was false, but the explanation, which blew me away, because only in an industry that no one understands could you get away with this. The defense was, our software engineering is so bad and our machine is so unstable that removing an icon from the desktop will destroy the operating system. And to anyone who knows the tiniest bit about computer science, I'm like, if that is true, then in fact your operating system should be outlawed, because that's like saying we have a bridge that is so weak that if you walk across it, that's enough to make it collapse.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, thanks to the network effects, it didn't matter one way or the other. They were found guilty, and they're still the by far the dominant player. Okay, is that the last of our?
There's one other thing, which
Yeah.
is and this also speaks to our friend Bill Gates and our friend Steve Jobs, which is the ability to have scalable distribution. And the distribution is also so critical because you're in a race to scale, and your ability to get to scale is part of the things that helps you win. And so in the case of Bill Gates, one of his genius moves was in providing the DOS operating system to IBM for their PC. And by doing that, they got instant distribution from the most powerful player, then the most powerful player in the technology industry, and became the default industry standard. And the fact that IBM shipped with Microsoft DOS then meant that every other computer maker had to ship with Microsoft DOS. And it's a great example of how great distribution can just make it game over like that.
Got it. So you find companies that satisfy these 5 criteria, and then you invest in them.
Correct. Now, the tricky thing is, yes, you have to work to figure out, is a company actually in a blitzscalable market? But then the really tricky part is getting into the deals. Because if all those conditions exist, venture capitalists are pretty smart folks. They usually figured out that the company that is growing 10x year over year is probably worth investing in. And so they all line up
also,
to give
read
these
your
companies
book.
their money. And they read the book. Well, maybe,
Yeah.
I do find it's funny, as with any business book, I find that the number of people who cite the lessons of blitzscaling far exceeds the number of people who've actually read the book. Instead, what they've done is they looked at the cover and they picked it up, they put it on their shelf, and they listened to various interviews now and then. It's not clear they actually read the book. It's well worth reading, of course. Available in bookstores everywhere, Blitzscaling and blitzscaling.com. Anyways, but what happens is the venture capitalists line up to give these entrepreneurs money, and they compete like hell to give them their money. And so our secret sauce is actually being able to get in with a relatively small investment. So we tell the entrepreneur, listen, you want help from the guy who wrote the book on hypergrowth? You want me to help you figure out how to make your company a $100 billion company? No problem. You don't have to pay me exorbitant consulting fees, and you don't have to give me any stock for free. You just have to let us invest $1 million. And the beauty of it is that even though the existing investors probably don't want to let other folks in because it's such an opportunity, they want to hog it all for themselves. The CEOs of the companies that are so in demand have enough leverage to just say, yeah, you know what, we're going to open up $1 million for these guys. And that's what we've been doing. We invest $1 million a chunk into these companies, and it's always because the CEO has made room for us, because usually the companies are so in demand that most people are being turned away, and the amount of interest in any given round is 3 to 10x the total amount available.
Got it. So what you're telling us then is you have a lot of key man insurance for yourself because you're the big piece of the value proposition.
Correct. And to take you behind the curtain, I mean, there usually are these provisions in venture capital firms when you are raising them. And in fact, I am covered by that provision. If I am incapacitated or leave the fund, the limited partners can say, you know what, I'm out. Give me my money, release me from my commitments. So that is in fact the case. Hopefully, I will avoid such misfortune. And of course, I have no intention of leaving. But yeah, the legal reality is there.
Wow. Well, thank you. This has been fascinating, and you've once again reactivated my desire to invest in your fund. And for people who are interested, where can they find you?
So people who want to find me can just look at chrisyeh.com. That's CHRISYEH.com. That includes pointers to most places. You can usually also just Google me, just Google Chris Yeh, and I usually show up pretty much first. I do have my friend, the other Chris Yeh. If you ever have any doubts about which Chris Yeh it is, just follow the simple flowchart. Does he wear glasses? Yes or no? If he wears glasses, it's probably me.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will probably have you back at some point so we can continue discussing the principles of blitzscaling, because it's something that I think a lot of people have not heard of. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs and people in my network and, my kind of extended community. And I think that it would be really interesting to get these concepts out there more widely, because, hey, if you're going to spend your time building a company, you may as well build one that you believe at least has the potential to go really, really big. And that's not going to be my corner store.
Absolutely. And Steve, it's always such a pleasure to see you. Thank you for letting me on, and a happy 35th birthday, because I'm sure it's
Thank you
coming up
very
soon.
much. You too.